Xbox won't tell us how many consoles are sold, but PlayStation definitely will. A mere not even 24 hours ago, Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, said, hey, the current generation Xbox consoles are the fastest selling ever. Yes, the Series S and X are flying off the shelves whenever they're actually managed to get onto the shelves. But Microsoft left some things off the table, most importantly, how many they sold. Now, Microsoft has been pushing for a while and says, hey, Game Pass numbers, service and revenue, that is our jam. We don't care about how many consoles are sold because we have games in the browser. We have games on iPhones, we have games on Android, and so judge us by that. But the reality is people like myself and many fans of just the gaming industry in general want to know how many consoles are sold. And with Microsoft not telling us, that means we got to read between the tea leaves here a little bit and rely on partners and analysts to help us fill in the gap. So the official news comes from PlayStation, and they said, hey, we have sold 10 million consoles. And that's fantastic. That means that the gaming industry is alive. The gaming industry is healthy. And it's very clear that 2020 certainly helped propel the gaming industry higher in volume of sales because everybody was staying at home. So 10 million, that's really good. And it's also the fastest selling console for PlayStation ever. They did it in just 248 days, roughly about 21-ish days faster than they sold to 10 million with the PlayStation 4. So there you go. Faster selling than the PlayStation 4 by about 21 days. And that's commendable, and it's a good thing for Sony, especially considering the fact of all the shortage of the chips. Sony has said that there's going to be a supply chain struggle for them, likely into 2022, and they are just joining the rest of the industry and saying, hey, we're building them as fast as we can, and they're also selling them as fast as we can. Now, what does this mean on the Xbox side? Now, for probably more than a year now, many years, I've been saying with this generation of consoles, for Microsoft to have a good generation, they need to do a couple things. One, they need to sell a lot of Game Pass subscriptions because that's what Microsoft is judging themselves on. But the reality is when it comes to physical hardware sales, Microsoft last generation, it is widely believed in the industry, it was about a 2-to-1 sales margin. For every 2 PlayStation consoles sold, 1 Xbox One was sold, which means they sold about half as many PlayStation. So if they can close that gap at all, then Microsoft is off to a good start, or things are just going better this generation than they had been last generation. While we do not have any official numbers, we do have some analyst insight from Nico Partners, and you probably recognize this Twitter account right here, as I point to it twice. And what they believe is the deal right now with Xbox is that they have shipped 6.5 million consoles to the channel. Now, there's a couple of things we need to dive into here because Sony is saying, hey, we've sold this many consoles, and the analysts are saying this is what we see going out into the market. But the reality is we already know that every single console that is being put on a shelf is being sold. They're still not available. Microsoft has said there's a shortage. Their CFO believes it's going to be in through the next quarter, at least at minimum, going to be a shortage. So every console that goes into the channel is effectively sold, at least as of right now. If you do the basic math, and I know this isn't hard to do, if Microsoft has sold roughly 6.5 million and Sony's sold 10, that means that they have an increase from that 2-to-1 ratio about 15%, or 6.5 out of 10 instead of 5 out of 10, which is a pretty big deal for Team Xbox. It means that they are closing that gap, at least initially, up front. Now, there's a lot of things that play into this because right now we don't know actually how many consoles PlayStation is able to produce and how many Microsoft is able to produce, but I suspect that if Microsoft had 10 million in sales, they would be screaming that out right now, but we all kind of believe that that's not the case, and they don't want the negative headlines of, hey, Sony is outselling the Xbox again. But the reality is, one, they're based on their Game Pass subscription is what they really want to grow, but the reality is that they are closing that gap. At least that is from our first sort of unofficial, semi-official look, because I don't know if Microsoft will truly ever tell us how many consoles are sold unless it's really close to that. If they came out and said there was 9 million, I think a lot of people would be quite impressed, but we don't quite know. We have just our best estimates from third-party sources like the Nico Partners, who typically do a pretty good job of analyzing the gaming industry. So what does this actually mean? It just means that the gaming industry is healthy, that Sony is selling every single console they can. It looks like Microsoft is going to be able to gain a little bit of ground. And the reality is that gamers just have a lot of good choice as long as you can actually find the consoles. I mean, that's really the biggest challenge, I think, in the gaming industry, is not deciding which console to buy, because there's a lot of good games on both. It's just quite literally being able to buy them. So it's really interesting to see how this is starting to shake out. The other challenges here is going forward, this gap could, it's going to bounce around. It's not going to be a stable 15% gain for Microsoft at this point, because we don't know how many consoles are still going to be able to come over with such a supply shortage. And again, it's not just impacting Xbox and Sony. We saw it with Tesla. We've seen it with the car industry. We've seen it with the PC makers. Microsoft's own Surface revenue was down roughly 20% because they just can't get chips. And so we don't know how far out these companies have ordered consoles for. As an example, imagine Sony says, hey, we're going to have 5 more million consoles delivered by the end of the year. And Microsoft might say, look, we've ordered 7, but only 3 are going to show up. We don't quite know how that's going to play out. And that's going to dramatically impact those percentages. Short version meaning it's a little too hard to tell, honestly, where the consoles sit in the generation of just pure sales, because things are so muddied in the industry right now. It's really a dynamic effect. The biggest benefit, honestly, that Microsoft has, and I'm curious if we're going to see this be happening in the second half of this year. Microsoft should hopefully already know roughly how many consoles they're going to get, but I suspect we start seeing them pushing their cloud gaming, because, hey, anybody can sign up today. You don't need a console to go into your browser to play Xbox games. Granted, you can't play Flight Sim, but that might be related to potentially that not all hardware on the cloud is Series X yet. We don't quite know the full story there. A little odd that you can't play Flight Sim over their cloud gaming, but that's, one of the odd things that has happened, that, just typically Microsoft wants to launch all their stuff on day one, but here we are. Anyways, that is a unique benefit that Microsoft can push this generation to help bolster those numbers, even if they cannot get a console sales. So, interesting things happening in the gaming world as we look at the dynamics between Microsoft and Sony. The reality is that both of these companies can win independently and have no impact on each other. I strongly suspect that there might be a very large generation of gamers who are going to have a PlayStation 5 and also a Series S, just because it's really affordable and it makes it an easy way to get into those games. And let's be honest, I honestly believe that for the vast majority of gamers, the Series S is more than capable. Yes, the storage is probably the biggest limiting factor, but if there's only a couple titles you want to play, such as Halo Infinite, which will be coming out later this year, even though there's a technical beta this weekend, that might be the way to go, because you're still going to get 1080p gaming, you're still going to get high resolution or high frame rates, and you still get a very high performance CPU and HDR and everything else that you would want in a relatively inexpensive box from Microsoft. The question is, will you sign up for Game Pass, which is where Microsoft wants you to go? That's a whole different conversation, but I think that might be a very normal thing. I mean, typically in the world of gaming, we think you either have an Xbox or a PlayStation, and then a Switch is usually bundled in there just because, hey, it's a Switch. They sell good stuff, and you might want to pick that up. Anyways, point being here, while it looks like early on in the numbers, Microsoft might be doing pretty well. The reality is it's still a bit early, and the supply constraints are really hampering things. We truly can't get a better image until these consoles are readily available inside retail stores where you can go in and just buy them off the shelf, because as of right now, every single console that's being made by both manufacturers is being bought as soon as it hits store shelves, which means that there's definitely still more demand than supply. And what we don't know is the size of the demand for Xbox and PlayStation. We have rough ideas based on last generation, but we don't know how that narrative changes for this generation. So that being said, folks, if you want to stay updated about what's happening in the gaming industry, make sure you keep it subscribed here, because the only BS on this channel is me.